Thanks for joining us again. Another rainy night. How strange in New England this season. And thank you for joining us tonight. Another one of our Sacred Home series talks. Before we get started, a couple things that we have to do is thank our sponsors, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, Cape Cod 5, and Martha's Vineyard Savings, as well as to remind you that all of the talks that we're doing are all the books are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. We hope that you participate with them. Our guest tonight, William Cooper, is Professor Emeritus of History from LSU. He is an American historian who specializes in the history of the American South. Is regarded as a leading expert on the life of Jefferson Davis, but he decided to take his talents and write him about someone who was a little bit further north and also had a Massachusetts connection, and that's John Quincy Adams. So coming to us from Atlanta, Georgia tonight, would you welcome our guest tonight, Dr. William Cooper. Dr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. I appreciate that. Are you ready for me to begin?
I am. You are ready to go. You are well dressed and well informed.
All right, good enough. Well, I'm pleased to be with you. I must start out by saying that I'm not a real veteran of Zoom talks, but I will try to cope with it as best I can. John Quincy Adams is my topic, and people say, John Quincy Adams, who is that? Many adjectives have been used about John Quincy. He's lost, hidden, camouflaged in American history. And what I want to do this evening is not deal in detail with any aspect of his long and varied life, but to touch upon a number of themes that I think give an indication of the kind of person he was and the contributions he made, in hopes to try to stir interest in John Quincy and to give some clues about what made him the person that he was. For a man to be looked upon as lost, hidden, and camouflaged, as John Quincy has been described, is sort of astonishing when you look at his career. He was a minister, the United States minister abroad to the Netherlands, to Prussia, to Russia, and to Great Britain. The first of these missions, he was 27 years old. George Washington appointed him minister of the Netherlands. In between those, he was a United States Senator. Then he became Secretary of State. He served for 2 terms. James Monroe was president. Then he became President of the United States. And then from 1831 until his death in 1848, he served in the House of Representatives. An astonishing career. With that kind of pedigree, you think that for sure he would be one of the most well-known American figures. But he's not. And why is that? Well, I think there are 2 reasons. First, his main career took place between the Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Civil War, 2 great landmarks of American history. And often those people in between weren't connected with the comings or the fighting of either one of them, had just been lost. But second, and I think even more important, a political revolution occurred during his political career, a revolution that overwhelmed him and overwhelmed his reputation. And more about that later. I do have to add right now, though, that I think there's been somewhat of a resurgence in his reputation because of the renewed interest in anti-slavery politics and anti-slavery spokesmen. And as we'll see, John Quincy ended up as a powerful anti-slavery spokesman. His biography. Of course, he was a son of Massachusetts. His Puritan heritage was emphasized to him by his parents, both John Adams, his father, and Abigail Adams, his mother, descended from families who had come to the colony of Massachusetts in the 17th century. And they impressed upon him certain values that remain with his life. Religion. John Quincy Adams tried to read the Bible every single year, and he mostly succeeded. He not only read it in English, he read the New Testament in Greek. He moaned that he couldn't read the Old Testament in Hebrew, he didn't know Hebrew. But he also read it in French and German, and he would say that sometimes most difficult passages he found clearer in German than any other language. He was also a devoted church attendant. He tried to make worship services on Sunday all of his life. Also, John Quincy was very introspective. And again, that came from his Puritan heritage. And this introspection led to constant questions about whether he was worthy. And one way, the example of his introspection, he kept this voluminous diary from his youth until just before his death. It's an enormous corpus. And introspection, he always asked, was he worthy? But he was also ambitious. And his ambition came to him again from his parents. After all, his father was one of the leading founding fathers, and his father was the second president. And he was raised to think that public service was a great calling and great things awaited him. And then the Enlightenment had a powerful impact upon him, like it did upon his father and the other founders. From the 18th century French, in which reason was emphasized, not emotion. And the romantic movements that spread through America in the first part of the 19th century had no interest in use for him. He had no interest in romanticism, whether it was political or literary. For example, the Transcendentalists, his near neighbor Ralph Waldo Emerson, he thought these people were around the bend. He had no use for them. He identified himself with his father and the other founders. And of course, the founders, from George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, he knew them all. He had met them all. John Quincy was also an intellectual. He was steeped in the classics, Greek and Latin, modern languages as well. He knew Dutch, he knew French, he knew German, and a smattering of Spanish and Italian. And he became the first Boston professor of rhetoric at Harvard in the early 19th century. Now compare his major contemporaries, political contemporaries, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, Daniel Webster. These men certainly were able politicians, and they certainly had ambition, but the only one who could come close to Adams in intellectual pursuits and in intellectual ability was John C. Calhoun. And as we will see, his relationship with Calhoun went from admiration and friendship to enmity and detestation. This whole question of ambition and merit, he struggled with constantly through his life. As I said earlier, his ambition came from his youth and from his parents. But merit had to be central. Office or preferment had to come to him. There could be no self-promotion. He was not ashamed of being ambitious, and he would quote Shakespeare in his diary and say that wishing for honor is no sin at all, and yet he could not strive for it. There could be no overt striving. He had to convince himself that it came to him because of his own merit. Now, what about this political revolution that I mentioned that was so important in his life, and it had such a ferocious impact on his reputation? This political revolution occurred from the mid-1820s into the 1830s. It's associated with the name of Andrew Jackson. And at that time, the political world, the voting world, the political world was quite males. And now, of course, Jackson is denigrated by some because he was a slave owner and because he transferred Indians forcefully at West. But there can be no doubt about his influence at his time and the political revolution that was associated with him. It changed the way American politics revolved and where they were operated. And in fact, the politics of our own time really began then. And then what is the content? Well, there were organized parties. There were parties before the Jacksonian Democratic Revolution. I say democratic because in his time it was a little bit democratic, but parties were organized for the end result of being parties before. There was electioneering on a scale never seen before. And there were candidates who were eager to get before the public, and the public demanded candidates. There were newspapers, partisan that was set up just to support a candidate or a party. Money became much more important in politics because you were pressing for votes. And of course, then patronage. Lifeblood of politicians, giving office to those who would support you, or those who you hope would support you. Now, this revolution, John Quincy decried. He called it abominable. He condemned it. He condemned the revolution itself, and he also condemned all those who were involved with it. Individuals, including former friends. For example, I mentioned John C. Calhoun. When he was in Monroe's cabinet as Secretary of State, Calhoun was the Secretary of War. And he admired Calhoun greatly. In his diary, he talked about Calhoun as being a great American, as a person he could really admire. But when he learned that Calhoun was really actively trying to get the presidential call in 1824, he just decided that Calhoun had great faults. And he and Calhoun would fall out, and John Quincy had fallings out with other people. We'll touch upon one in a bit. But John Quincy detested the process. Anybody he detected on suspicion or was suspected actually trying to get office or campaigning for office, he could not abide. He simply wouldn't participate, even when it hurt him. For example, when he became president, the Postmaster General at that time and the Post Office Department in Adams's presidency in the late 20s was the largest employer in the United States. Postmasters were in every little community, and they were all appointed. And the Postmaster General had enormous patronage power, enormous political power. Well, the Postmaster General, when Adams became president, was an individual who had gotten his job because he was a supporter of John C. Calhoun. He'd gotten it during Monroe's presidency. Well, this man had no interest in supporting John Quincy Adams's future as a politician or his program. And Adams's friends would tell him, look, this man is really trying to hurt you. He's actually working to fire people who want to help you and putting your enemies in place. But Adams would not get rid of him. Adams said he could not fire somebody simply because they opposed him. The person had to be guilty of malfeasance of office, etc., etc., etc. In other words, he let a man who was actively his enemy, political enemy, working hard to hurt him and working in an effective way, stay in office. He just simply would not play the political game. And of course, what happened with his attempt for re-election in 1828, he was overwhelmed. He considered his defeat something horrible that had happened to him and happened to the country. He felt that he had been pushed aside by a tidal wave of politics that were infamous politics, that were dirty politics, that did not follow the example of the founders. And the man who headed that, of course, was Andrew Jackson. And he and Andrew Jackson at one time had been fast friends. He had supported Jackson earlier in Jackson's foray into Florida back in the late 18 teens. And he and Jackson were friends, admired each other. But when Jackson turned out on politics to be opposed to him, and then he and Jackson fell out. And if you look at the history of John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, two great haters. They tried to out-hate each other, but neither one could succeed because they were both so good at hating. And of course, from John Quincy's point of view, he had nothing to do with it. He was all virtue and goodness. It was all the other person's part. John Quincy never admitted to himself, and I say to himself because this is what his diary is all about, that he had anything to do with any enmity between former friends like Calhoun and Jackson and himself. But another reason that he and Jackson fell out, and this has to do with a great theme in his post-presidential career, had to do with the institution of slavery and with the political power of slavery. there were two parts to the slavery question as far as John Quincy was concerned. What really occupied him. The first was a constitutional clause, the 3/5 clause of the Constitution, which, as you know, counted slaves as 3/5 of citizens, which meant that they added to the numbers in the southern states, the slave states, which gave them more congressional representatives in the House, and which meant they also had more electoral votes. And for John Quincy Adams, this 3/5 clause had two cardinal problems. The first was he believed that the 3/5 clause enabled opponents to defeat his father's reelection and his own. And who defeated his father and him? But two Southern slave owners, Thomas Jefferson in 1800 and Andrew Jackson in 1828, and both these men swept the South. And of course, the 3/5 clause gave the South added electoral votes. That's the first problem with the 3/5 clause. They allowed virtue to be defeated. I mean, the clause did. The second part of that, it gave too much power to the South. Now, why was he concerned about Southern power? Because Southerners tended to support states' rights. They tended to be opposed to increased central authority. And for John Quincy Adams, he wanted a strong central government. And so for him, the government dominated by Southerners and Southern ideology that would restrict the power of the central government was the wrong way to go. An example, he ordered an act of government that would be very involved in what today we call infrastructure. In his time, it was a building of roads and canals. And he wanted a national program funded by the national government throughout the country. Well, for Southerners and their political arm, the Democratic Party, the Jackson Democratic Party, this would give entirely too much authority and power of the central government, and which the central government might then use it to injure or even to damage or to even abolish crucial parts of the Southern community, namely African American slavery, which was at the core of Southern society and the Southern economy. But more than just the political difficulties that came out of the slavery, the 3/5 clause, slavery for John Quincy was a moral evil. It was a horrible moral blot on the country. He said it violated the Declaration of Independence, the Great Declaration. Of course, the preface would say all men are created equal. And for John Quincy, the Declaration was the key American document, the key document of the Revolution. He placed it far above the Constitution because it was a moral statement of what America was all about. And slavery just violated its fundamental principles. Yet, early on, his qualms about slavery, his reservations about slavery, and you get to about 1820, and it's not just qualms, reservations, it becomes this hatred of slavery and this vigorous enmity, but he kept it private. It's in his diary. And even after the Missouri crisis of 1819 to 1821, I'm sure all of you have heard of the Missouri Compromise, which grew out of the effort of Missouri to become a new state in 1819, a new slave state. Compromise was formed and passed by Congress, which admitted Missouri as a slave state, and Maine as a free state, and slavery would be allowed in the territory west of Missouri, the southern border of Missouri to the Rocky Mountains, the border of the country at that time, the Louisiana Purchase border. But this Missouri crisis really galvanized Adams in slavery. He condemned slavery. He condemned the Southerners. He condemned Southern politicians in his diary. In his view, he said this was the occasion for somebody great to rise up and lead the country in the right direction, the moral direction, the direction the founders would have wanted. But that somebody great was not going to be him. Not in 1819, 1820, 1821. And why is that? Here comes ambition. John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State. And at that time, the Secretary of State seemed to be the stepping stone to the presidency. After all, Thomas Jefferson had been Secretary of State. And immediately after him, James Madison moved from that position to the presidency. Then following Madison, James Monroe moved from Secretary of State to be president. And now John Quincy was Secretary of State, and he wanted to be president. He wanted to follow Monroe, but he was not about to do the kinds of things that he condemned Calhoun and others for doing to strive to get it. And yet he wanted it very much, but he knew that if he took up cudgels against the South and slavery, he was done. Because at that time, the only political party surviving, the Jefferson Party, the Republican Party, was dominated by Southerners. There was no chance. And of course, in 1824, he did run for president. He didn't win. There were a number of strong candidates, and none of them got a majority of electoral college. And the Constitution directed that the top three go to the House of Representatives. Well, John Quincy came in second. Both the electoral count and the popular count came in second to Andrew Jackson. And yet, when the House of Representatives in February of 1825 decided who would be president out of those three people, Jackson and John Quincy Adams, and the third was a person nobody ever hears of, a man named William Crawford. He was a fourth, a distant third. Adams won. He won on the first ballot. He got 13 votes. Each state got one vote, 13 votes, put him over the top. And of those 13 votes, 4 came from slave states. So almost 1/3 of his winning votes came from the slave states. And he got those votes. And he was named president because chiefly of one man, a man named Henry Clay. Henry Clay was a Kentuckian. He was the most influential man in the House of Representatives. He was a slave owner. But he helped put John Quincy Adams in the White House. And then as president, John Quincy made Henry Clay Secretary of State. Again, the stepping stone. And he put 2 other Virginians in his cabinet. As president, he made no statements against slavery. He took no action against slavery, whatever. And his diary when he's president is much less voluminous than before. He was too busy to keep it up in the table. But there are no real diatribes against slavery. Then comes the 1830s. In the 1830s, John Quincy changes. He becomes an unfettered politician. He had a congressional district centered on when he lived in Quincy, down from Boston. There was something that's called the Plymouth district. Plymouth was in his district. He was safe in that district, and that was as far as he could go. He tried to be both governor of Massachusetts and the United States Senator from Massachusetts. He failed in both. He couldn't even win statewide office in Massachusetts, but he was ensconced in his district, and he could say what he wanted to say. He could do what he wanted to do. And he became a stalwart and even strong anti-slavery spokesman. And why is this? It had to do both with his moral objection to slavery and his detestation of Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party and the power of the South in that Democratic Party. He thought Jackson unfit for president. He thought Jackson leading the country in the wrong direction. He thought Jackson's Democratic Party, with its Southern strength, leading the country in the wrong direction. And he took strong positions, particularly on petitions to Congress asking for abolition. In the Constitution gave citizens the right to petition Congress, and John Quincy delivered hundreds of them. They didn't have to come from his constituents. In fact, he delivered thousands of them, even if he didn't agree with some of the things they asked for. And he loved to goad the Southerners. He loved to try to push them, to get them up and angry. It gave him great pleasure. At the same time, he was an abolitionist. He dealt with abolitionists, but the abolitionists knew he was not one of them. He didn't think immediate uncompensated emancipation was the way to go. He'd always hoped that the Southerners would come to some understanding that slavery had to end and there would be some sort of, extended but generally emancipation program. But even then, he could compartmentalize. He gave three major speeches in the 1830s. He gave eulogies of James Madison and of James Monroe, and a speech in New York City commemorating George Washington's 50th anniversary of Washington's first inauguration. All three of these men were slave owners. And this decade is when John Quincy is assaulting slavery stem to stern. But in none of these long addresses is there any mention of slavery at all. He admired all three. He respected all three. And his three addresses are nothing but praise. Nothing about slavery in any of them. Even in his attacks on the politicals, the Southern Democrats, he excoriated. But Southern Whigs, he didn't really say very much about them. And he really had some fine, favorable things to say about a few Southern Whigs. They were not the target or the target of his assaults, as the Jacksonians and the Southern Democrats were. Now, all this to do with slavery and politics ends up being the question of the Union. And here we see a transformation of John Quincy. I would maintain that no one was more important in the history of the United States in the first half century of national existence, except maybe George Washington, and having the country become more powerful and growing the country. Early on, in the 1790s, he would speak of Americans. He was asked what are the differences between Virginians and Massachusetts men. He said, we're all Americans, all Americans. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, he supported the Louisiana Purchase, even though the people in Massachusetts who put him in the Senate didn't want it. The Federalist Party of Massachusetts was opposed to it. Also in the War of 1812, those same Federalists in Massachusetts and Union opposed the war. John Quincy supported the war. He said it was necessary for national honor and to maintain national independence. Then he became Secretary of State. In 1819, he negotiated a treaty with Spain. It's called the Transcontinental Treaty, the Adams-Onis Treaty. Onis was the Spanish minister. This treaty brought Florida to the United States and also made the United States for the first time a continental nation because it gave to the United States Spain's claim to the Pacific. So John Quincy took the country from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And yet, no. In his diary, he said, so this is a treaty he negotiated and was proud of it. He said in his diary also that it was a crowning achievement of his life. He said if he had been a member of Congress from a northern state, he would have voted against it because Florida was coming in with slaves. You see how he could compartmentalize. Then, of course, in the 1830s in the House of Representatives, there's one thing he did. When he left the presidency, he thought he was going to spend his time writing a biography of his father, whom he thought was unappreciated, but he really couldn't get going on. And he was approached to run for Congress. His family was opposed, his wife was appalled, but he did it, and he broke precedent because none of the preceding presidents had had any public life after they left the executive mansion. That's what it was called in his day. But he, in the House, he aligned with the anti-Jackson Party, the Whig Party. And though he claimed always on his own terms, he was never a good party man as such. Again, he felt with the Democratic Party and the Southern power based on slavery that governed it, they didn't support the Union that he envisioned. And he saw them as mortal enemies to his Union, and I've said that several times this evening because that's really important and I want to emphasize it. And by mid-decade in the 1830s, he gave a major House speech And he was the first important, really terribly important American political figure to do this. He said the Union could not continue both slave and free. He anticipated Abraham Lincoln by 20 some years. Again, he was the first major political figure to come to that point and publicly, and yet he was a man who had done so much to build the Union as it was. He had always praised the Union. He considered himself not only a biological son of the founders, but a ideological son of the founders, and that was for Union. This division that would come, he said, would probably come with violence, because the South would never agree to any emancipation program, that probably civil war would come, and there would be a slave rebellion, and there would be much bloodshed. But he said that was necessary and it would be right. Of course, in the 30s and the 1840s, politics did not go John Quincy's way. From the time he was in the House until his death in February of 1848, and I know some of you know that he died in the House chamber. He had a stroke in the Capitol itself. He was distraught. He saw the annexation of Texas, the mid-40s, and the onset of the Mexican-American War as gambits for the expansion of slavery. He was appalled. But he kept telling himself he couldn't believe a just God would permit this kind of pro-slavery America to survive. He was saying, if only the Whigs could nominate a good anti-slavery man for president in 1848. Of course, he didn't live to see the person the Whigs nominated. If he had, he'd have been appalled. Zachary Taylor, a military hero of the Mexican-American War and a slave owner. But during all this time, just before his death, he wrote a letter to his son in which he said, don't give up, keep plugging. He didn't use the word plugging. Don't get up. He said, persevere. I hope I conveyed to you a complex and fascinating man. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. That was excellent. Thank you for doing this. One of the things that's always fascinated me about John Quincy Adams is his longevity and his willingness that as a former president, even though he goes through a really bruising two elections against Jackson, he's willing to come back as a congressman, and most, for everybody else who's ever been president, that's the pinnacle. They're not coming back as something as a lower, lesser legislator, and yet he was willing to do that. What do you think motivated him to continue into public service when everybody else would have just called it a career?
Well, I think he was searching and brought for vindication. He had been repudiated, and he felt unfair. And it hurt him. He became the second president not to attend his successor's inauguration. He didn't go to Jackson's inauguration, just like his father didn't go to Jefferson's. And I think I'm right in saying nobody since Adams has refused to attend his successor's inauguration. He wanted vindication. And he also looked upon the House as he could speak for people. And he thought that was what America was about. But I would put at the top of the list vindication. And he luxuriated in the fact that he won re-election in his congressional district, even after redistricting. I think the smallest percentage he ever got was 55, and the largest was something like 80. He was a colossus in his district, and he liked that. And of course, when he took up the anti-slavery cause, he had a real rostrum, which he wouldn't have had otherwise.
How do you think he viewed what's maybe his crowning accomplishment, the Monroe Doctrine? How do you think he felt about that?
Well, of course, it's called the Monroe Doctrine. It should be the Adams Doctrine. It was he who convinced Monroe to take that stance, and he wrote the part of Monroe's message that conveyed the doctrine. He wanted the United States to be the #1 power on the North American continent, and he wanted the United States to be unchallenged in this hemisphere. When the Spanish Empire collapsed, he wanted nobody else in Europe coming to replace the Spanish. He wanted America to be dominant. He wrote messages to Europe. Of course, he knew that the only country in Europe that could come and replace Spain was Great Britain, because Great Britain had been made to do it. And he also believed Britain wouldn't do it, but he wrote these strong messages that this was off limits, that the United States wouldn't get involved in Europe, and Europeans shouldn't get involved on this side of the ocean. When Britain offered to join the United States in a communique saying that the former Spanish Empire was off limits to Europeans, President Monroe wanted to do that. But John Quincy talked him out of it. He says, let's go follow the British. His famous phrase, let's go come in a cockboat and wait for the British man of war. Let's do it on our own. He wanted America to stand up on its own. And that was all his doing. It should have been called the Adams Doctrine.
The title of your book is The Lost Founding Father. And in many ways, it's probably the last founding father, because he was so acquainted with all of them personally and professionally. Who do you think he admired most? Who do you think he least admired? What because he certainly had interactions with so many of the people that.
Well, that's a relatively easy question to answer. The people he admired most were George Washington, his father. The people he admired least were the founders, of course, was Thomas Jefferson. That's an interesting story in itself, because he first met Jefferson when, as a teenager, he was in France with his father when John Adams was sent over there to help negotiate the peace treaty. He met young John Quincy met Jefferson, and he and Jefferson got along famously. But after Jefferson defeated his father in 1800, John Quincy had no use for him. And he was at the White House a couple of times when Jefferson was president, and in his diary he makes quite clear that he thinks Jefferson is a person who likes to call attention to himself, and speaks much too loudly about himself, even duplicitous. He had no use for Jefferson. So it's easy to say the founders, Washington on the one hand, and his father along with Washington, and Jefferson was the one that he disliked the most. In part too, because Jefferson defeated his father. That comes in there quite clearly. He thought that was a terrible wrong that Jefferson had, that his father had been defeated for re-election. But no, when John Quincy died, though he had spent the last decade plus in his life condemning the South, almost the last decade and a half, one thing I did was look at a lot of Southern newspapers after he died and see what they would say about it. And while they all, both Democrat papers and Whig papers, and I looked at them from Virginia to Texas, would say they didn't like his politics, they all called him an American institution, because he connected them with the revolution. He knew the founders, and that gave him a status and a stature that nobody else in his time had by the 1840s. And even people who detested his politics looked upon him as an institution who connected with the founder.
You'd mentioned how he dealt with some of the next generation, the Clays, the Websters. At the end of his time, did he feel he was out of his time? You know, having been associated with the first generation of American leaders, and now with the second generation, did he feel a little bit of like fish out of water?
It was definitely a devolution in American political leadership, no question about that. And he thought the country was going in the wrong direction from Jackson's election right on down. The one thing that gave him some hope in those years was William Henry Harrison won in 1840. But of course, Harrison died after 1 month in office, and the person who became the vice president, John Tyler, was an old states' rights Southern. And so John Quincy had no use for him. And John Tyler managed to get Texas annexed, which John Quincy abhorred. No, he was very despondent and distraught about the future of the country and where the country was going. But that's why the quote I used, and I finished my book with this quote, told his son, don't give up, persevere. He had a deep conviction that somehow a just God would not let America be dominated by what he thought of as a slaveocracy.
So do you have another project after this one, or is it, are you going to enjoy retirement?
I'm on vacation. I'm not like John Quincy Adams. I'm not eager to get back in the fray right now.
Okay.
Maybe in some time I will, but not right now.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time. I know that Zoom's not your favorite, but thank you for doing this tonight. I want to thank your son for setting this up for us, and for you doing this. I greatly appreciate it. Good luck with this book. Thank you for taking the time with us.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Good night to you.
All right. Thank you, everybody.